In the quiet suburban town of Rose Hill, where nothing ever seemed to happen, an unspeakable tragedy would soon shatter the veneer of normalcy. At first glance, the town appeared peaceful, a place where families thrived and neighbors greeted one another with friendly smiles. But beneath this idyllic surface lurked a story that no one could have imagined, a tale of forbidden desire, obsession, and murder. The story didn't begin with a crime, though. It began with a family, or at least what was left of one. Helen Prescott, a middle-aged woman living with her daughter Emily in a modest house at the end of a cul-de-sac, had always prided herself on being a good mother. After her husband left them, Helen had devoted herself entirely to raising Emily, pouring every ounce of her energy into ensuring that her daughter had everything she needed. And for years, that had been enough. One evening, as Helen stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner, she heard the familiar sound of Emily's laughter floating in from the driveway. It was a sound she had always loved, a reminder that despite everything, she had done right by her daughter. But tonight, that laughter stirred something different in her, something darker. She knew what, or rather who, was causing Emily's joy. Michael. Her daughter's boyfriend had been around for nearly a year now, a handsome young man with an easy smile and a charm that seemed to captivate everyone he met. He had been polite from the beginning, treating Helen with the respect and kindness she had grown unaccustomed to in her years as a single mother. At first, she had seen him simply as Emily's new love interest, a young man who made her daughter happy. But as time went on, things began to shift. Helen couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, when her casual admiration of Michael turned into something more, something she couldn't control. Perhaps it was the way he always looked her in the eyes when he spoke to her, giving her his full attention, something she hadn't experienced in so long. Or maybe it was the way his hand would brush against hers when they passed plates at the dinner table, the brief contact sending a shiver down her spine. It was one night after dinner, when Emily had gone to bed early, that things began to change. Helen had lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, pretending to clean up even though everything was already spotless. Michael had stayed behind to help, and as they stood side by side at the sink, washing dishes in comfortable silence, Helen felt a tension between them that hadn't been there before. When he handed her a dish to dry, their fingers brushed, and this time, neither of them pulled away. Helen's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt alive. She looked up at him, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected, something that told her she wasn't imagining things. From that moment on, everything changed. Helen began to obsess over Michael, though she hid it well, or at least she thought she did. Every time he came over to see Emily, Helen found herself watching him, studying his every move. She noticed the way his smile lingered on her a little too long when he said hello, the way his eyes followed her whenever she walked past him. It was subtle, but it was enough to fuel the fire burning inside her. She told herself it was harmless, that she was simply enjoying the attention. After all, it had been years since anyone had looked at her the way Michael did. She was a middle-aged woman, no longer in the prime of her life, and Michael was young, vibrant, full of life. He made her feel young again, made her feel wanted in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the weeks went on, Helen's obsession grew. She found herself waiting for the moments when Emily would leave the room, giving her and Michael a brief window of time alone together. It wasn't much, just a few stolen glances, a lingering touch here and there, but it was enough to keep her wanting more. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and Emily had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day at work. Michael had come over to keep her company, as he often did, and the three of them had spent the evening watching movies together. Helen had been sitting in her armchair, pretending to watch the film, but her eyes kept drifting to Michael, who was sitting on the couch beside Emily. As the movie played on, Helen noticed that Michael wasn't paying attention either. His eyes kept flicking toward her, meeting hers for just a second before darting away. It was a game they had been playing for weeks now, and it thrilled Helen in a way she couldn't explain. But tonight, something felt different. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Helen could feel her heart pounding in her chest. When Emily finally drifted off to sleep, Helen seized the opportunity. Let her sleep. she whispered, standing up and motioning for Michael to follow her into the kitchen. "She's had a long day." Michael hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Emily's peaceful face. But then he nodded, quietly rising from the couch and following Helen into the other room. The moment they were alone, the tension between them became unbearable. They stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of them daring to speak. And then, without warning, Michael stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Helen's breath caught in her throat as he reached out and touched her arm, his fingers sending a shockwave through her body. She looked up at him, her heart racing, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The guilt, the fear, the knowledge that this was wrong, it all melted away in the face of her overwhelming desire. And then, just like that, they kissed. It was brief, just a fleeting moment of contact, but it was enough to change everything. Helen pulled back, her mind spinning, but the look in Michael's eyes told her that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Helen and Michael's affair grew, their stolen moments becoming more frequent and more intense. They would meet in secret whenever Emily wasn't around, their passion for each other growing with each passing day. Helen knew it was wrong, that she was betraying her daughter in the worst possible way, but she couldn't stop herself. She was addicted to the way Michael made her feel, the way he looked at her, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel alive again. And the story didn't end here. As the affair continued, Helen's obsession with Michael deepened. She found herself thinking about him constantly, daydreaming about their time together even when he wasn't around. She would lie awake at night, replaying their moments in her mind, her heart aching with the knowledge that he could never truly be hers. And then, one evening, everything came crashing down. Emily had gone away for the weekend with friends, leaving Helen alone in the house. She hadn't planned on seeing Michael, but when her phone buzzed with a text from him, her heart skipped a beat. "Can I come over?" Without thinking, Helen replied with a single word. "Yes." When Michael arrived, the tension between them was palpable. They didn't speak as he stepped inside the house, and the moment the door closed behind him, they were in each other's arms. Their kisses were frantic, desperate, as though they both knew this was their last chance to be together. As they lay together afterward, Helen felt a cold wave of reality wash over her. This couldn't last. She knew that. Michael was Emily's boyfriend, and sooner or later someone was going to find out. But the thought of losing him, of never seeing him again, was more than she could bear. And then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. Helen's heart pounded as the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. She and Michael froze, tangled in the sheets of her bed. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Helen sat up, the sudden jolt pulling her out of the haze of her affair, and the reality of what they had just done crashed down on her like a tidal wave. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Panic flashed across Michael's face as he scrambled to sit up. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall. She wasn't supposed to be home yet. She wasn't supposed to know, but there she was, standing on the other side of the door, a truth on the verge of exploding out into the open. Helen felt bile rise in her throat. The rush of guilt was so overpowering she thought she might faint. They had been so careful to keep their stolen moments hidden, so careful to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But now, it was all unraveling. "I'll handle it," Helen muttered, her voice barely audible. She threw on a robe covering the evidence of what had transpired and hurried down the stairs. As she reached the front door, she took a deep breath, trying to calm the wild thudding in her chest. She opened the door just a crack. "Mom?" Emily's voice was soft, her eyes wide with worry. "Why did it take you so long to answer?" I was just in the shower," Helen lied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "You weren't supposed to be home until tomorrow. Is everything okay?" Emily didn't answer right away. She glanced over Helen's shoulder as though searching for something, someone. "Is Michael here?" she asked. Helen felt her stomach twist. "No!" She lied again. "Why?" Emily looked down at the ground, her brow furrowed. I thought I saw his car outside, and he wasn't answering my calls." There was a pause, the kind of silence that stretches on and makes the air feel heavy, like the seconds are dragging you under. Emily's eyes locked on Helen's face, searching for something her mother wasn't prepared to offer. Honesty. But Helen couldn't give that, not now, maybe not ever. She forced another smile, though it felt like her face might crack. "I haven't seen him since last night, honey. I'm sure he'll call you soon." Emily hesitated. "Okay," she finally said, though her voice was filled with doubt. She stepped back, her eyes still lingering on her mother. "I'm just going to head home. Call me if you hear from him, okay?" Helen nodded quickly, her heart racing in her chest as Emily walked back to her car. She watched as her daughter drove away, her figure disappearing down the street, and only then did Helen allow herself to exhale. She closed the door and leaned against it, her head spinning. That had been too close. Far too close. When Helen returned to the bedroom, Michael was already dressing, his expression dark with fear and frustration. "This isn't going to work," he said, his voice low but trembling. "She's going to find out." Helen's heart sank. "She won't," she said, more to convince herself than him. "She doesn't know anything." Michael shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "She's suspicious. You saw the way she looked at you. We can't keep doing this." The thought of losing him, of having to end things before they had even truly begun, filled Helen with a deep, crushing despair. She couldn't imagine her life without him anymore. Michael had become her lifeline, her source of happiness in a world that had long since turned cold and empty. She couldn't go back to the way things had been before. She wouldn't. But Michael wasn't convinced. He continued pacing the room, his frustration palpable. "This was a mistake," he muttered. "I never should have let it get this far." Helen felt a sharp stab of pain in her chest. "You don't mean that," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. She stepped closer to him, reaching out to touch his arm, but he pulled away, his face clouded with guilt. "We need to stop this, Helen, before it's too late." Too late? It was already too late. Helen could feel her world crumbling around her, the threads of the life she had built with Michael unraveling in front of her eyes. Desperation clawed at her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt completely powerless. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need you." Michael's face softened for a moment, and for a brief second, Helen thought she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had ignited a fire in her she thought had long since burned out. But then his expression hardened again, and he stepped back, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Helen," he said, his voice breaking. "But this isn't right. It's not fair to Emily. She deserves better." And just like that, the fragile fantasy Helen had built around them shattered into a million pieces. Michael turned to leave, but before he could take another step, Helen grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Panic gripped her like a vice, squeezing the air from her lungs. She couldn't let him go. Not like this. Not ever. "Please," she begged, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't do this." But Michael's mind was made up. He pulled his arm free from her grasp and walked out of the room, leaving Helen standing there broken and breathless as the door slammed behind him. For days, Helen didn't hear from Michael. She tried calling him, texting him, even driving past his apartment, but he never answered. Each moment of silence was like a knife twisting in her chest, a reminder that he had chosen Emily over her. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced, and with each passing day, her obsession with him grew darker, more dangerous. Helen couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. All she could think about was Michael, his smile, his touch, the way he had made her feel alive again. And now it was all slipping away. The thought of him being with Emily, of him kissing her, touching her, loving her, made Helen sick to her stomach. She couldn't bear it. She wouldn't. One night, after days of torment, Helen made a decision. If she couldn't have Michael, No one could. It was a rainy evening when everything came to a head. Emily was out for the night, visiting friends, and Helen knew that Michael would be alone. She drove to his apartment, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs to his door, each step bringing her closer to the point of no return. When she knocked, there was no answer. For a moment, she thought he wasn't home, and a sick sense of relief washed over her. But then the door opened, and there he stood. Michael, the man she had risked everything for. His expression hardened the moment he saw her. "What are you doing here, Helen?" Helen's heart pounded in her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "There's nothing to talk about," Michael replied, his voice cold. "It's over. You need to accept that." But Helen couldn't accept that. She wouldn't. Without thinking, she pushed past him and stepped into the apartment. Michael closed the door behind her, his frustration evident as he followed her into the living room. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. Helen turned to face him, her eyes wide with desperation. "I love you, Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't just walk away from this." Michael shook his head, his face clouded with guilt. "This was a mistake, Helen. I never should have let it go this far." Those words, so final and cold, shattered something inside of her. Without warning, Helen lunged at him, her hands grabbing at his shirt as she screamed, "You can't leave me!" But Michael pushed her away, his expression one of shock and anger. "Helen, stop. This isn't right." The rejection, the anger in his voice, sent Helen over the edge. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The world blurred around her, and before she knew what was happening, she grabbed the closest object, a heavy glass vase from the coffee table, and swung it at him with all her strength. There was a sickening thud as the vase made contact with Michael's head, and he staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. Blood began to pour from the wound, staining his shirt. But Helen barely noticed. She was in a daze, her mind clouded with rage and heartbreak. Michael collapsed onto the floor, his body limp, and in that moment, the reality of what she had done hit her like a freight train. Helen dropped the vase, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and blood continued to pool around his collapsed body. The sight of Michael lying there, his life slowly slipping away, sent Helen into a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, regret, and the undeniable twisted sense of satisfaction that he was finally hers in a way no one else could ever have him. For a few moments, she could only stare at the man who had consumed her every waking thought. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't bring herself to think clearly. She knelt down beside him, her shaking hands hovering over his body, unsure of what to do next. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and disbelief. His name felt foreign on her lips, as though the person lying there was no longer the man she had been so obsessed with. This wasn't part of the fantasy she had built in her mind. This was real, and it was terrifying. Blood trickled from the gash on Michael's head, pooling on the floor beneath him. His breaths were shallow, his eyes half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Helen shook him gently, as if she could somehow wake him up and undo everything that had just happened. But it was too late. Michael wasn't responding. "No," she whimpered, panic bubbling up inside her. "No, no, no." This wasn't supposed to happen. Helen's mind raced, trying to grasp onto any thread of rational thought, but there was none to be found. She had crossed a line, one she could never come back from. She had killed him, or at least she was on the verge of it. As she knelt beside his motionless body, the sound of his faint breathing started to fade. The sharp metallic scent of blood filled the room, suffocating her. Helen's chest heaved with shallow breaths, her pulse racing. Her hands were stained with the blood of the man she had once dreamt of loving, of keeping forever. Now that same love had driven her to this, an irreversible mistake. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and deafening as she stood up and stumbled back from Michael's still body. She didn't know what to do next. Everything had happened so fast. What had she done? For a split second, Helen considered calling for help. An ambulance? The police? But then, the grim realization settled in. What would she even tell them? That she had killed her daughter's boyfriend in a fit of jealous rage? That she had been in love with him? Obsessed with him to the point of madness? No, no one would understand. No one could ever know. Helen's thoughts shifted, panic taking hold. She had to act fast. She couldn't let Emily find out. She couldn't let anyone find out. The fear of what she had done, the fear of losing everything, overwhelmed her. She glanced around the room, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do next. There was blood everywhere. It was on the floor, on her hands, on her clothes. She had to clean it up. She had to make it look like an accident, maybe. But even as the thought formed in her mind, she knew deep down that there was no covering this up. But the story didn't end here. Suddenly, a noise broke through the fog of her thoughts, a loud knock at the door. Helen's heart seized in her chest. Who could it be? For a moment, Helen stood frozen, her mind whirling with panic. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. Helen looked down at Michael's lifeless body, then at the blood-streaked floor beneath her feet. She had to do something. Anything. She couldn't let whoever was outside see this. With trembling hands, Helen wiped the blood off her face as best she could, and she glanced around the unfamiliar apartment. Michael's apartment. She had driven here in a fit of desperation, hoping to salvage what was left of their doomed affair. But now, the sight of Michael lying motionless on his own living room floor was all too real. Her stomach dropped when she saw who it was. Mom? It was Emily. Helen's hands shook as she tried to block Emily's view of the apartment. "Why aren't you answering your phone? I've been calling you," Emily said, her voice laced with confusion and concern. I didn't hear it," Helen stammered, her voice barely holding together. She stepped forward, her body tense, trying to shield the blood-splattered apartment behind her. "Mom? What's going on? Why are you at Michael's place?" Helen's heart raced. She couldn't let Emily see the blood, the body, or the truth behind what had happened. I needed to talk to him, but he's not home." Helen quickly lied again, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. But Emily wasn't buying it. She stepped forward, pushing past her mother into the apartment. "I'm coming in," Emily said, her tone firm and unwavering. Helen's heart dropped as she failed to stop her. "Emily, no!" But it was too late. Emily stepped into the apartment, and the moment she did, her eyes landed on the horrific scene in front of her. The blood on the floor, the signs of a struggle, and then Michael's lifeless body sprawled out in the middle of the room. "Michael!" Emily's scream pierced the air, filled with pure horror. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake. "Michael, no, please, no!" Helen stood frozen by the door, watching as her daughter's world shattered before her eyes. Emily's desperate sobs filled the small apartment, each one slicing deeper into Helen's chest. She had done this. She had taken everything from her daughter. Emily looked up, her tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief and rage. "What did you do, Mom? What the hell did you do?" But Helen couldn't speak. She couldn't find the words. Emily's cries echoed through Michael's apartment, each sob growing louder, sharper, as the reality of the situation sank in. Helen stood frozen, her back against the door, her hands trembling. She wanted to explain herself, to make Emily understand, but there was no explanation that would ever make sense. What had she done? Emily knelt beside Michael, frantically pressing her hands against the gash on his head, as though she could somehow stop the bleeding and undo what had been done. "We have to call someone. We have to get help," she cried, her voice hysterical, breaking into sobs between words. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The idea of calling anyone, police, paramedics, anyone, felt like a death sentence. They would come. They would see what she had done, and she would lose everything. Michael was gone, and soon so would be her freedom. But what choice did she have? There was no hiding this. I'll call," Helen muttered, barely hearing her own voice as she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking violently. She dialed the emergency number, her mind spinning, her heart pounding as the phone rang in her ear. Emily was sobbing, holding on to Michael's limp body as though she could bring him back by sheer force of will. He was fine. He was fine just this morning. Mom, what happened? Helen's mouth went dry. She couldn't lie anymore. Not to Emily, not after everything. It was an accident, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to. It just happened. Emily turned to look at her, her face a mask of betrayal and disbelief. You killed him, she said, her voice hollow. You killed him, Mom. Helen collapsed into the nearest chair, her body feeling too heavy for her legs to support. The truth of Emily's words sank into her like a knife. There was no taking this back, no fixing it. She had killed Michael. She had taken the man her daughter loved from her. The moments that followed were a blur of flashing lights, sirens, and cold, sterile voices. Paramedics arrived first, but it was already too late. Michael was dead. They covered his body with a sheet, Emily screaming in the background, pleading with them to do more, to save him. Helen watched it all from the corner of the room, her body numb, her mind distant. It was like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare, unable to wake up. The paramedics couldn't save Michael, and soon after, the police arrived. 2 officers entered the apartment, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. One of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a hardened expression, approached Helen. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us," he said. Helen nodded, too broken to resist. They placed her in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her wrists as they led her out of the apartment. She could hear Emily sobbing behind her, but she couldn't turn around. She couldn't face her daughter. As they led her out into the rainy night, Helen's thoughts spiraled back to that fateful moment, when the vase had connected with Michael's head. The look of shock in his eyes, the sickening thud of his body hitting the floor. She had acted on impulse, driven by a toxic mix of obsession, jealousy, and desperation. And now, her life is over. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. Helen's affair with Michael came to light, the details spilling out into the courtroom like poison. The media latched onto the scandal, painting Helen as a cold-blooded murderer and a deranged woman who had allowed her obsession with a younger man to drive her to violence. Emily, who had once adored her mother, sat silently in the courtroom every day, her face pale and drawn. She never spoke to Helen again. Helen tried to reach out, tried to explain, but Emily wouldn't hear it. The bond between them had been irrevocably severed, and Helen knew it would never be repaired. As the weeks passed, Helen's fate became clear. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The sentence didn't surprise her. In fact, she welcomed it. There was no escaping the weight of what she had done. Michael was gone. Emily was gone. And she would spend the rest of her life paying for her sins. In the months that followed her sentencing, Helen sat alone in her prison cell, replaying every moment of her affair with Michael over and over in her mind. What had started as a thrill, a brief escape from the loneliness of her life, had spiraled into something far darker, something that had destroyed everything she held dear. As time wore on, Helen stopped expecting letters or visits from Emily. She knew her daughter had moved on with her life, leaving her behind just like she deserved. The silence was her only companion now, and she accepted it. But in the darkest hours of the night, as Helen lay awake in her cell, haunted by the memories of Michael's touch and Emily's tears, she couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if she had just let him go.